Welcome back to Morbidium, where the stories don't fade, they linger. Last season, we walked through the shadows, unsolved disappearances, fractured timelines, unanswered questions that still echo through the dark. But this season, we go deeper into the files that were closed too soon, the voices that were silenced, the truths that were buried beneath over fear and time. This isn't just true crime, it's the anatomy of what lingers after. Every case we tell carries weight for the victims, for the families, and for the communities left searching for peace. And as our audience continues to grow, so does our responsibility to tell these stories with integrity, empathy, and relentless curiosity. Season 3 is about unfinished business, cold cases that refuse to stay cold, mysteries that unravel when you pull the close thread, and the chilling realization that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what happened, it's what didn't. So dim the lights, lock the doors, and lean in close, because the truth is out there, and we're not done looking. This is Morbidium.
Right, so today we're heading to Tallahassee, Florida in May of 1959. And before anyone thinks this is one of those quirky historical crime episodes, it's really not. This one's heavy, it's brutal, but it's also really important because somehow, against all expectations, it ended in something that we can only call justice.
Yeah, this is one of those cases that sits right at the crossroads of race, gender, power, and the legal system in the Deep South. And I'll say this up front, what happened to Betty Jean Owens was horrific. But what happened after, that's what makes this story historic.
So here's the headline version. In May 1959, in Tallahassee, Florida, 21-year-old Betty Jean Owens was kidnapped and brutally assaulted by four white men. And this was at a time when black women's voices were routinely ignored. But she would testify. In a groundbreaking outcome, all four men were convicted.
And when we say groundbreaking, we mean it. This is at a time when the Jim Crow laws were at their peak. This was the segregated South. White men were not convicted for crimes against Black Americans. They had never been convicted of raping Black women. It wasn't how the system worked.
No, and that wasn't the system failing. That was it just doing its job.
No, and let's talk about Betty for a minute. Betty Jean Owens was 21 years old in 1959. She was a student at Florida A&M University, which is a HBCU, a historically Black college. Um, FAMU was and is still a huge source of pride in that community. And it wasn't just a college, it was a space of Black excellence in the middle of Jim Crow Florida.
And let's not sugarcoat this. That was not exactly a progressive paradise back in 1959.
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. Segregation was still the law of the land at that time. This is 5 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, but that doesn't mean integration was actually happening in practical application. The South was pretty dug in, and crimes against Black women, they were dismissed, they were ignored, or buried.
And particularly when the accused were white men, because historically in the Jim Crow South, the legal system had a very clear pattern. Black men accused of crimes against white women were prosecuted aggressively and often violently, whereas white men accused of crimes against black women, that was a different story entirely.
Exactly, and everybody in that community knew it.
So the evening in question, Betty and three of her friends are just out driving around in Tallahassee. They were just young women out for the evening, but then their car stalls. Now, we've most likely all experienced car trouble. It's annoying, it's inconvenient, And you think, right, brilliant, this is how my night ends.
Right. And that's when these four white men came along: William Collinsworth, David Beagles, Charles Greenlee, and Ernest Knox. And they offer to help.
They offer to help. It's not going in a wholesome direction.
Not at all. What seemed like help quickly turned into a threat. The men pulled a gun and took control of the situation. Betty was forced into their car. She was abducted while her friends were left behind.
Which is a detail that always hits me because those friends would have had to just stand there watching as this happened and knowing they couldn't do anything to stop it. That helplessness must have been absolutely terrifying and horrific.
They immediately went for help, and that part matters. They didn't freeze. Didn't just stand there and twiddle their thumbs. They didn't hide it. They reported it. Meanwhile, Betty was taken to a secluded location and sexually assaulted for hours. And I'm not going to sensationalize that. What she endured was prolonged, violent, and very traumatic.
Now, here's where contacts becomes a thing. In 1959 in Florida, this kind of crime against a black woman by white men, I mean, as we've mentioned before, this was almost never punished severely, if at all.
The expectation in that community would have been nothing would happen. Or if something does happen, it would be minimal, a slap on the wrist, things that we've heard more recently. Oh, it was just kids being kids at most.
And that's because historically, the courts simply didn't treat black women as victims in the same way as a white woman would be.
And yet, this case didn't follow that script. The suspects were arrested within hours.
Yeah, within hours. And that is remarkable in itself.
It is. Law enforcement actually acted quickly. The men were taken into custody, but that was just the beginning. The students at Florida A&M University mobilized fast, and I do mean fast. They organized protests, they demanded justice, they made it very clear that this case was not going to disappear quietly.
Which, frankly, probably changed everything because public pressure really does matter.
Oh, it absolutely does. When a community is watching, when students are organizing, when people are saying, we see you and we expect accountability, that changes the atmosphere. This wasn't going to be handled behind closed doors.
And we've got to remember this was well beyond social media. This was organized through word of mouth, student networks, churches, local leaders. It's grassroots pressure.
And it worked.
So the trial took place later that year in July of 1959 and it was held in Tallahassee. And let's paint the picture. It was an all white, all male jury.
That's so crazy. In the deep South, during segregation, you can imagine how intimidating that courtroom must have felt to this woman who had already been a victim. And yet, Betty Jean Owens testified. That cannot be overstated. She stood up in that courtroom full of white people as the minority and described what happened to her.
And I don't think anyone can deny that that must have took extraordinary courage because black women who reported sexual violence were often disbelieved, blamed, or just ignored and humiliated. But she testified anyway. And here's the part that shocked the South. All four men were convicted of rape.
I did that thing where accidentally scrolled way beyond my notes and I had to go back. Yeah. So all four men were convicted of rape by an all-white jury, and not just convicted. They were initially sentenced to death, which was almost unimaginable at the time. Historically, white men had not received death sentences for raping black women in Florida. This was unprecedented.
And unsurprisingly, it sent shockwaves across the state. Now, to be clear, the governor later commuted those death sentences to life imprisonment, but the conviction stood, and that is what really mattered.
This case became more than a legal proceeding, it became a symbol. It showed that organized community action could demand accountability. It challenged the racial assumptions baked into the legal system, and it demonstrated that Black women's testimony could not be automatically dismissed.
I mean, yeah, it didn't fix the system. I mean, we're not going to sit here and pretend it did, but it did crack something.
Exactly. And for Betty Jean Owens, the trauma was immense. That part doesn't disappear because there was a conviction, but her courage changed the trajectory of that case, and arguably the legal expectations surrounding similar cases in the South.
Right, so we've talked about what happened and the verdict, but I think we need to sit for a minute because modern listeners, the outcome might sound like, well, yeah, they committed a crime, they were convicted, and that's what's supposed to happen.
But that's where history, I was going to say historically, but it's kind of where you get this historic humbling a bit because in 1959 in the Deep South, that was not what was supposed to happen. When the victim was a Black woman and the defendants were white men, it was supposed to be more of a verbal reprimand or maybe some probation or them being chastised. But that's not what happened here.
I mean, no, because, like you said, the Southern legal system under the Jim Crow law, it operated under a racial hierarchy. It was like, I mean, full stop, that's what it was. The courts reflected that hierarchy. There was this grotesque mythology in the South, and it protected white womanhood that was used to justify violence against black men. There was no equivalent culture protection extended to black women.
And I think that's something that people don't always realize. The legal system aggressively prosecuted Black men accused of crimes against white women. We have just covered sweet little Emmett Till. And that was horrific. And they did this with almost no evidence ever. But white men who assaulted Black women, those cases were almost always ignored. They were downgraded or never even brought to trial.
And even when they did go to trial, convictions were rare. And when they happened, they might as well not have. I mean, serious sentences were extremely rare. So when we're saying that sentencing four white men to death for raping a black woman was unprecedented in Florida, that's not us just being dramatic in our storytelling. I mean, that's a historical reality.
Here's another important detail. Rape laws at the time were deeply entangled with race. In many southern states, the death penalty for rape was disproportionately applied to Black men accused of raping white women. The inverse was almost unheard of.
Yes, so this case flipped the racial script of the Southern courtroom, and that's part of why this was so shocking.
So let's talk more about Florida A&M University because I don't think we can overstate the role that student activism played here. FAMU students organized these protests. They demanded the accountability. They made it clear to the government, to elected officials, that this case was being watched.
And that really did matter in a small town southern city in 1959 because pressure changes incentives. If this case had quietly faded into procedural obscurity, it might have just followed the typical historical pattern.
Instead, there was attention, there was community presence, there was organized outrage, and it was disciplined. And I think that that's important. This wasn't chaos, it was coordinated. Students understood even then that visibility was power.
I often think of student activism exploding in the 1960s. You know, we've all heard about the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the massive demonstrations. But here we are in the 1959, and you can already see that organising energy starting to build.
Absolutely. The civil rights movement didn't just appear out of nowhere in the 60s. It was already active, already mobilized, and it was already strategically thinking.
So let's go back into that courtroom for a minute. I mean, I do think it's important to remember this was an all white, all male jury. And I mean, I can't help but think of Betty Jean Owens and how terrifying that must have been for her.
You can imagine walking into that space, and she was 21 years old. At 21, you're still young, you're still a kid. And this was 1959, and you're describing the most horrific thing that's ever happened to you to a room full of white men in a segregated legal system. I think it's also important that we step to the side and address that these jurors who were the white men would have also had to have some sort of reassurance that they weren't going to be targeted or their families weren't going to be targeted because they found these men guilty. That takes a level of courage that's hard to even conceptualize.
I mean, yeah. I mean, we sit here and I've looked into this case. I did a lot of research, and me and you have back and forwarded on this one a lot. But we talk about her bravery. We talk about Betty Jean. We don't think about the pressure that was put on those jurors because this was unheard of. This wasn't accepted. This wasn't allowed almost. Everyone involved in that trial, I mean, it wasn't just courage. It was it was kind of a resolve because she and they would have known the odds historically. And I mean, up until that point, this was a system that had not been kind to women of her race.
And yet she testified clearly, and the jury believed her. Now, we should be careful not to romanticize the jury. I don't want to do that. This wasn't suddenly a courtroom full of racial enlightenment, but the evidence was strong, and the arrests were swift, and the case was highly visible, and the prosecution moved decisively. And it did help those jurors to be able to leave that courtroom, go home to their families and community, and say, I did what I was told to do in a court of law.
I mean, yeah, it is possible that this wasn't just about the sheer brutality of the crime, because history shows that that wasn't ever often enough when it comes to black women with white male attackers. But the brutality
When those
combined
death
with the community scrutiny, I mean, it pretty much made it impossible to ignore.
sentences were handed down, it sent shockwaves through Florida. Newspapers covered it extensively. People across the South took notice because this was not how the racial power structure usually operated.
But then comes the political reality. I mean, the governor later commuted the sentences to life in prison, which, let's be clear, I mean, even doing that, the conviction overall was still significant. Life imprisonment for four white men who'd been convicted of raping a black woman at that time, I mean, that was still extraordinary.
It was, but it also shows the tension. The original sentence was pushed against the boundaries of what Southern politics was even prepared to tolerate at that time. Commuting to life imprisonment may have been a way of stabilizing that tension.
I mean, yeah, it really is one of those moments where you see both progress and resistance happening simultaneously.
Single handedly reform the Southern legal system. We need to be honest about that. Black women continued to face systemic injustice. Sexual violence remained under prosecuted in many cases and still does.
But we can give that the symbolic precedence did matter because once something happens, it becomes possible. I mean, before this case, the idea of white men receiving a death sentence or even life in prison for raping a black woman in Florida was pretty much unthinkable. But after this case, it was possible.
And that shift, even if narrow, chips away at the assumptions underpinning the system. It challenged the idea that Black women's suffering was legally invisible.
And it exposed the oh my God, this is one of those words I can't say. It exposed the hypocrisy of a justice system that claimed to value morality and justice, but historically only applied that morality selectively.
I know that's a word you like. It's one of your British quirks. I do that about you. This case, we need to circle back because it's important that it sits at the intersection of race and gender. Black women historically faced what scholars call double jeopardy, and it marginalized both uh, for their race, for their gender. Their victimization has been minimized, and it's still minimized.
And that makes Betty Jane Owens' testimony even more significant. She didn't just speak as a victim of violent crime, she spoke in a system that had systematically devalued women just like her.
And that's part of why historians still reference this case when discussing civil rights era legal shifts. It represents a moment where the courtroom, however briefly, disrupted its usual racial script.
But you know what gets me? It's the randomness that started all of it. I mean, this all happened and nobody's going to complain about it because it did make huge changes. But with something as simple as a stalled car, I mean, that's it. That's the hinge moment between an ordinary night and life-altering trauma.
It's always that ordinary detail that hits the hardest for me. You don't leave the house thinking, oh, tonight will be the last night of my life, or tonight's going to make history, or tonight events are going to change the world.
And yet, because of what followed, the arrests, the mobilization, the trial, the conviction, this did become a landmark case.
And we have to hold both truths at once, Allie. This was a horrific act of violence. It was also a turning point in legal accountability in the segregated South.
Yeah, so after those convictions in the commutation of the life sentences, the headlines did eventually fade, as they always do. And I think that sometimes it's worth sitting with that because for Betty Jean Owens, this didn't just become a historical milestone. I mean, this was a lifelong trauma for her.
That's such an important point. We can talk about precedent and symbolism and legal shifts, and those things matter. But at the center of this story was a 21-year-old young woman whose life was permanently altered. Justice in a courtroom does not erase violence.
No, it just prevents total injustice. And historically speaking, that alone was rare enough in this context to be remarkable.
You are so right. These men, William Collinsworth, David Beagles, Charles Greenlee, and Ernest Knox, remained convicted. The life sentences stood, and in 1959, Florida, that alone marked a significant break from the racial norms of sentencing.
And I mean, it's strange, isn't it? I mean, we're describing life imprisonment as extraordinary progress, which says everything about how skewed the system was.
Historians point to this case when discussing civil rights era legal reform, not because it immediately transformed the system, it didn't happen then, but because it demonstrated that pressure could produce accountability. And accountability wasn't theoretical here, it actually happened.
And it happened within segregation. I mean, that's the key here. This wasn't post Civil Rights Act. This wasn't after federal oversight. This was 1959, and Jim Crow was still fully operational.
which makes the jury's decision even more striking. Some scholars argue that the visibility of the case and the rapid arrests made it harder for the court to ignore the crime. Others have suggested the brutality itself left little room for dismissal. But either way, the legal outcome broke from historical precedent.
And once President cracks, it creates space. I mean, not a revolution, but space. And there's something else here that I think we should talk about. I mean, narrative control. Because historically, Southern legal narratives center white victimhood and white protection. The idea of protecting Southern womanhood, and I mean, that was weaponized repeatedly.
But Black women were excluded from that narrative of protection. Their assaults didn't ignite outrage in the same way. They weren't afforded the same presumption of innocence or I just want to take a moment to say that these people had been enslaved people and their religious beliefs had been forced to be converted to Christianity. So now they're trying to remain pure until marriage. And this woman had all of that taken away from her because Black women were not afforded the same presumption of vulnerability as white women.
And that is why this case matters symbolically. I mean, it's a forced legal system, even if briefly, to
And that,
acknowledge a black woman as a legitimate victim who was deserving of full justice.
that acknowledgement disrupted the racial mythology that underpinned the Jim Crow laws. It said the harm done to her counts. And that may sound basic to us now, but in 1959 Tallahassee, that was not a small statement. We also can't ignore the timing. 1959 sits right before the explosion of the 1960s civil rights movement. The sit ins, freedom rides, mass marches. FAMU students were already organizing, already demanding change.
And this case becomes part of that momentum. It's an example of community pressure influencing legal outcomes. It's proof that collective voice can move institutions, even rigid ones.
And that lesson carried forward because the early 1960s would see increasing student led activism across the South. You can almost feel the shift building in cases like this.
And I mean, I do want to come back to Betty herself because we talk about courage a lot, especially on this podcast. And it's one of those words that can start to sound like almost ceremonial. But courage in this context means standing in a courtroom full of white men. And we're going to say it again back in 1959 when she stood there and recounted like brutal sexual violence, knowing that historically her story, what she'd suffered, was not going to be taken seriously. And I mean, that's not abstract bravery. I mean, it's pretty visceral.
It is, and it's also exhausting. Survivors are expected to be symbols, to carry movements on their backs, to represent progress. But she was a young woman who experienced unimaginable trauma for hours. And yes, her testimony helped secure a historic conviction. But that doesn't mean she owed that to anyone.
I mean, exactly. We can sit here and we can honour her impact without turning her into a monument.
You know what's wild though? The thing that started it all, like you said, that stalled car.
And I'm telling you right now, if my car stalls, I'm suspicious of absolutely everyone within a 200-foot radius.
Where?
But genuinely, I mean, it shows how quickly ordinary life can fracture. One minute you're just driving around with friends, the next you're in the middle of a case that historians will still be discussing decades later.
History rarely announces itself when it begins. The Betty Jean Owens case didn't eliminate racial bias in Southern courts. It didn't end sexual violence. It didn't dismantle Jim Crow. It didn't give Black women more of a voice. It exposed cracks. It demonstrated that white perpetrators could be held fully accountable for crimes against Black women, even during segregation.
And that's what matters because legal systems operate partly on precedent and partly on expectation. Before this case, the expectation was it was nothing. Let's just put it that way. But after this case, I mean, dismissing these people who thought they could do these things and get away with it, I mean, they realized that that wasn't guaranteed.
Right, right. After this, legal impunity wasn't guaranteed. And for communities that had long experienced that dismissal and disregard, that shift, even if it was limited, it mattered deeply.
I mean, yeah, when we look back now, it's easy to imagine history as this steady march of progress, but cases like this remind us that progress often arrives in jagged and uneven bursts.
At, Often at enormous personal cost. The justice system today still grapples with those disparities around race and gender. We're not pretending that those vanished in 1959. But this case stands as a moment where the system deviated from its usual discriminatory pattern.
I mean, yeah, it's a reminder that change doesn't always begin with sweeping legislation. Sometimes it begins with a single case where the outcome refuses to follow the script.
So when we remember Betty Jean Owens, we remember two truths at once. You and I have said this. We remember the brutality of what she endured, and we remember that her testimony led to convictions that were unprecedented in Florida at the time.
Yeah, we remember that in May 1959 in Tallahassee, Florida, a 21-year-old Florida A&M University student was kidnapped and assaulted by four white men. And we remember that against the expectations of the segregated South, those men were convicted, initially sentenced to death, and ultimately given life imprisonment after the death sentence was commuted.
And it was a landmark moment in legal accountability. Not the end of injustice, but a rupture in it.
And sometimes, historically speaking, a rupture is where change begins.
Okay, y'all, if you made it through this episode with us, thank you. This was a heavy one, tremendously sad, but it's very important that we remember Betty Jean Owens.
And as always, history isn't just dates and verdicts, it's people. We'll see you next time.